In the modern British monarchy, the most dangerous weapons are not leaks to the press or public scandals. The most dangerous weapons are quiet rules, written on cream-colored paper, presented in a private sitting room at Windsor Castle. We have all been told a very specific story about the royal family. We are told to look for the drama, the arguments, the shouting matches behind closed doors, but true power doesn't raise its voice. It simply draws a line. Recently, Prince William and Princess Catherine made a decision about Queen Camilla's future. It was a decision that King Charles never expected to hear from his own son, and when Charles finally understood what they were telling him, he didn't argue. He didn't fight back, he just sat there in absolute silence. Because this wasn't about a title. It wasn't about another petty family disagreement hidden behind palace doors. William and Catherine were drawing a hard boundary around the next reign, and Camilla was standing on the wrong side of it. Before the meeting ended, Charles heard one sentence from Catherine that made the entire Queen Mother model collapse around him. Today, we are stepping inside that room at Windsor Castle. We are breaking down the one-court principle, the secret consultation with Princess Anne, and the brilliant, ruthless strategy that guarantees the next monarch will inherit a crown, not a shadow. Let us set the scene. The meeting took place at Windsor Castle on Thursday, the 13th of August, 2026, at exactly 6:25 in the evening. King Charles had been briefed that the meeting concerned future transition arrangements. In royal code, that is a remarkably dry phrase. It usually means discussing staffing rotas, updating diaries, and ensuring continuity of state events. Nothing explosive, nothing that would prepare a father for a confrontation with his son. But when Charles walked into the private sitting room that evening, he found William and Catherine waiting for him. Between them sat a cream folder. Printed across the front were 4 simple words: the next reign household. Charles sat down. He looked from William to Catherine. William didn't open the folder. Catherine did. That small movement shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. It sent a clear message to the king. This decision hadn't come from William alone. Catherine wasn't there merely as a supportive wife. She was an architect of whatever was inside that folder. When Charles began reading the first page, the future he had quietly assumed for his wife began to dissolve. There was no aggressive language, no sentence declaring that Camilla would lose her title, no demand that she be exiled from the family. The wording was administrative, cold. One sovereign, one working household, one center of royal authority when the next reign begins. It sounded like a bureaucratic reshuffle until the reality of the consequences set in. If Charles died before Camilla, there would be no automatic second royal court built around his widow, no inherited palace machinery, no guaranteed communications team, no permanent institutional staff simply because they had served the previous reign. Camilla could remain family, she could keep her lawful status, but William and Catherine were making one thing unmistakably clear: the monarchy after Charles would belong entirely to the next king and queen. To understand why this hit Charles so hard, we have to look at what inspired Catherine's strategy. 3 days before the Windsor meeting, Catherine had been at Kensington Palace reading a briefing document on previous royal transitions. Most of it was routine history until she reached the events of 1952. King George VI had died. Princess Elizabeth became queen. His widow Elizabeth became the Queen Moth. She moved into Clarence House and remained one of the most visible, powerful royal figures in Britain for decades. She had a massive staff, endless engagements, deep patronages, and an enormous public presence. Catherine read that section twice. Then she noticed a phrase that changed everything: Queen Mother precedent. She asked her advisors what that precedent would mean for Camilla. The answer was carefully worded. A surviving consort could continue public work, keep a household, retain ceremonial visibility, and remain surrounded by an established network of influence. Catherine listened. Then she asked the question that nobody in the room wanted to answer. Would Camilla have her own household? The silence that followed lasted just a beat too long. Catherine's concern wasn't personal animosity. It was institutional. A household isn't just a house. It means advisors. It means schedulers, communications directors, invitations, patronages, and intelligence briefings. It means a physical residence from which influence can continue to radiate. Individually, each piece looks harmless. Together, they create a second center of royal gravity directly beside the new sovereign. And that is what bothered Catherine. The Queen Mother arrangement worked in 1952 because Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was the new Queen's mother. The bond was blood. Camilla, however, would be William's stepmother. Catherine herself would be queen. Different relationships, different histories, and entirely different pressures. Catherine turned to William and asked the question that forced him to stop treating this as a technicality. Were they planning their own reign, or were they preparing to inherit assumptions made for somebody else? William immediately resisted the idea. He knew exactly what would happen if they touched Camilla's future. The press would call it revenge. The ghost of Diana would dominate the headlines. Catherine would be accused of pushing another queen aside, and William would be accused of settling an old family score. He wanted no part of that narrative. Then, Catherine said something he hadn't expected, something that completely changed the trajectory of the monarchy. She said, "If the rule looks personal, make it apply to me too." William stared at her. Catherine was entirely serious. She proposed a rule stating that if William died first and their son George became king, she would not expect George to build a second court around his mother either. No separate Catherine household carrying institutional weight beside George's reign. No automatic authority inherited simply because she had once been queen. She would remain George's mother. She would keep her dignity and continue her charitable causes. But the crown and the machinery of the monarchy would belong to him. In that single moment, the entire argument shifted. This was no longer a targeted strike against Camilla. It was a universal rule, a principle that Catherine was willing to impose on her own future self. The thought was uncomfortable, and that is exactly why it worked. William knew what Catherine represented to George. He knew the trauma of losing a parent as a young heir, because he had lived through it himself. The idea of reducing Catherine's formal position after his own death felt deeply personal, almost cruel. Yet Catherine was asking him to separate two things the monarchy has always blended together: family love and constitutional authority. From that point on, the wording of the document tightened. One reign, one household, one sovereign at the center. The advisors stripped away anything that sounded vindictive. No reference to Camilla by name, no mention of Diana, no language about removal or humiliation. The rule had to be structurally ironclad, yet entirely neutral. But there was one massive obstacle left: Clarence House. Back at Windsor, Charlie All is finished reading the first page. He looked up slowly. The room no longer felt like a routine meeting. His first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. He said, "This is about Camilla." William answered carefully. "It affects Camilla." Charles held his gaze. "That is the same thing." Before William could respond, Catherine spoke. "No, it isn't." That answer unsettled Charles more than an argument would have. He turned back to the paper. He stopped at one specific line and asked the question William had been dreading. "What happens to Clarence House?" Nobody answered immediately. That pause carried decades of history. Clarence House wasn't just a building. It had been the London home of the Queen Mother for almost 50 years. Charles had grown up with his grandmother as a permanent royal force, deeply woven into public life throughout his mother's reign. To Charles, Clarence House was proof that a widow could remain important without challenging the sovereign beside her. It was a reassuring, familiar model. But William was preparing to break that assumption. He looked directly at his father. "Nothing is automatic." Charles didn't move. William continued, breaking the silence with surgical precision. Not the house, not the office, not the staff, not the institutional role. Charles leaned back. The conversation became painfully personal. "And if I'm not here to protect her?" Charles asked. For a moment, the monarch disappeared. He was just a husband worried about his wife. William's expression softened, but his answer did not. "She won't need protection from us." Charles looked at him. "Then what do you call this?" William waited a second. "A boundary." Charles had spent decades waiting for the crown. Now his son was forcing him to imagine the day when that crown had already passed from his head. He was being asked to picture Camilla alive, inside a monarchy that no longer belonged to their household. Defeated by the logic, Charles turned toward Catherine, expecting her to be quiet. Instead, she moved the argument somewhere he hadn't antique. "I pitted." "It applies to me too," Catherine said. Charles stared at her. The sentence didn't fit the narrative he had been building in his mind. Catherine explained that if William died before her, she would accept the exact same principle. She wouldn't expect George to preserve a separate court around her. She wouldn't assume William's staff should remain hers. She wouldn't demand a permanent institutional voice beside her son's throne. Then Catherine gave Charles the line that stopped the room cold. "My son should never have to inherit my authority as well as his father's crown." Charles looked down at the folder. He didn't answer. No explosion, no dramatic rejection. He simply sat back. Catherine had removed his easiest defense. He could no longer claim the rule existed only because of a vendetta against Camilla. She had surrendered the same future privilege herself. Charles finally lifted his head. He made one request. Camilla should hear it directly. By 7:10 that evening, the door opened, and Camilla entered. She knew immediately that the dynamic had shifted. Nobody offered the polite smiles that normally soften awkward family meetings. William stood, asked her to sit, and began. He explained that when the next reign eventually began, there would be one sovereign at the center of the institution, supported by one principal working household. No second court would continue automatically beside the new king. Camilla's face changed. She understood the implication instantly. "Meaning mine," she said. William corrected her quietly. "Meaning the king's." He was separating the man from the office. Whoever wore the crown would control the household attached to it. Camilla looked at Catherine, then back at William. "And me? You remain family," Catherine answered first. Camilla held her gaze. "But not royal." "That is not what was said," Catherine replied. "You..." Unmoved, William stepped in. Camilla's lawful status wouldn't be erased. She could continue personal charities. She could attend family occasions. But the automatic machinery, the staff, the communications office, the official representation, would end with Charles's reign. Camilla turned toward Charles. "So the moment you are gone, I disappear." William spoke before Charles could. "No." He explained that disappearing and losing automatic institutional authority were two different things. A former queen could remain part of national life without operating a shadow court beside the sovereign. Then William delivered the sentence that brought the entire proposal into focus. Family is not the same as government. Camilla went still. For years, her public identity had been built entirely around service beside Charles. The proposal didn't erase those years, but it refused to guarantee that the structure supporting them would survive him. Then, William turned the first page over, revealing a second sheet beneath it. At the top was a heading Camilla hadn't seen before, the One Court Principle. Beneath that heading was a list of names and future situations that made one thing suddenly clear. This rule was vastly bigger than Camilla. The principle would apply to every surviving consort. Catherine was listed. George's future spouse was listed. Even Charlotte's future position was covered if she ever took the throne. It wasn't a private arrangement for one difficult transition. It was a permanent succession rule. When one reign ended, the institutional household ended with it. The second sheet removed the only argument Camilla had left. She could no longer claim the proposal isolated her because Catherine had already accepted it, and every future consort would face it. The structure was designed to outlive the people currently sitting in the room. Before the Windsor meeting, William had taken this exact principle to Princess Anne. Anne had watched the Queen Mother operate as a living force. She knew the history. Wise. William wanted to know if ending that model would weaken the monarchy. Anne's response was brief and devastating in its clarity. Different reign, different family. She told him the next king had to be allowed to be king. Nothing more. That distinction protected the crown. Loyalty to a former queen could remain warm and visible without becoming a second chain of command. As the meeting broke apart, Camilla and Catherine left the room. The door closed. For the first time that evening, Charles and William were alone. Charles was no longer asking about Camilla. His next question was about Catherine. He asked if William had truly thought about what this rule could mean for his wife one day. William answered without hesitation. Every day. Charles pushed. Could William really accept Catherine stepping away from the machinery of the crown without resentment? William looked toward the door Catherine had just walked through. He gave the answer Charles hadn't expected. No, but she is. That was the part Charles couldn't dismiss. Catherine hadn't supported the principle because it cost her nothing. She had supported it because she believed the next sovereign must inherit freedom, even if that sovereign was her own son, and even if it cost her own power. The following morning, William and Catherine signed the document. No celebration followed. There was no victory to announce because both understood that the paper described a loss they might personally endure themselves. For decades, the British monarchy lived under the shadow of the Queen Mother model. Clarence House was the symbol of that era, but William and Catherine have chosen a different path. They have chosen a monarchy of absolute singular authority. Charles entered Windsor believing the meeting was about staffing. He left having seen the monarchy after his death, and the biggest question still remains unentau. Swerd, who controls Clarence House when the next reign begins? That single answer will decide whether this principle remains words on paper or becomes the most visible break with the past in modern royal history. We are tracking the shifts in power the palace wants you to miss. If you want the real story behind the crown, hit subscribe and turn on notifications.